So I'm going to do an introduction to this video also. How to make it rain in the desert. Well, first I'm going to show how that actually happened. It was actually, the reason we have deserts is because that was actually formed from the global flood, Noah's flood. Pushing up the mountains, because how rain actually works is, you have the oceans, water evaporates into the atmosphere. The rotation of the earth is what creates wind that pushes that over land. It falls on the land and is supposed to restore the water tables, which cause vegetation to grow. But what has happened is because of global flood, it pushed up mountains that are too high that are causing rain shadows all over the earth, which in turn is what stops the rain from getting rain from getting to the land, and that's why we have deserts formed, which has dropped the oxygen levels around the world because we don't have enough vegetation to convert from photosynthesis, sunlight, carbon, and water into oxygen. So, I'm going to show how the mountains were formed, and a simple solution: drop the mountains. Level them out, which will open up the rainways, and we can heal the land and start growing vegetation, and not just normal vegetation. Start doing it diverse for different types of fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. And you can do that just by the way nature works is you could just dump seeds all over the ground, and then where people live actively change the landscape to restore water tables and just work our way in as we start to grow more and more and push into those areas that nobody's living in anyway. So that what that'll also do is give us more usable land for people to live, creating new towns, cities, and stuff like that, and creating housing that integrates with nature, and you can have plants growing around buildings and houses inside and on top of, keeping the oxygen levels stable and pushing them up. And as soon as that happens, we start living longer, because when the oxygen levels go up, it starts creating angiogenesis in our bodies, creating new blood vessels from old ones, and your body will constantly heal itself. And when that happens, guess what happens? You live longer, you live hundreds of years, your body stays younger because it's constantly healing itself with new blood vessels constantly being made from the old ones. So that's how that works. And I'm going to show how that happens in this video, but that's my introduction, and then you can actually see it for yourself. Enjoy the video. Oh, and yeah, one more thing. By when restoring the land, do it to where it has a diverse thing of plants that grow food. When we have food everywhere, that ends world hunger, at the same time making everybody more prosperous, because you won't have to, one of the biggest expensive that everybody on the planet has is food. Take that expensive away, what happens? Everybody becomes more wealthier by taking care of that. That way, if you want to, you have food growing all over the place. You just take it and you use it, and you save your money. You spend it on someone else. If you want to go to a restaurant, the price is dropped because the food is highly available. The only thing that you're paying for is for them to prepare it for you. That's it. So the price of everything drops and wealth goes up for everyone.
We can see on our planet 25 major features that can now be systematically explained as a consequence of a global flood that erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 30 trillion hydrogen bombs. This theory shows us just how rapidly major mountains form. It explains the coal, oil, and methane deposits, the rapid continental drift, and why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. This theory also explains the ice ages, and it gives the primary reason for global warming. It explains the formation of the layered strata in almost all fossils, the frozen mammoths, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. Surprisingly, it explains the origin of comets, of asteroids, and of meteorites.
According to Dr. Brown's theory, the ancient world that Noah lived in was very different from the Earth we occupy today.
Noah and other pre-flood people probably lived on one very large supercontinent with lush vegetation, inland seas, and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 6,000 feet high. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 6,000 feet high. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 6,000 feet high. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 6,000 feet high. Before the flood, about half the Earth's water was in interconnected chambers, about 10 miles below the Earth's surface. This formed a thin spherical shell, almost a mile thick. The pressure in the subterranean chamber had been increasing for centuries because the gravity of the sun and moon produced tides in the subterranean water that lifted and lowered the Earth's massive crust twice a day. This tidal pumping added gigantic amounts of energy to the subterranean water. This increasing pressure in the subterranean water steadily stretched the crust as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began as a microscopic crack that grew in both directions at almost 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched claw. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. The Bible even gives us a precise date, 600th year Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. Then it says, and the rain fell. The fountains of water jetted supersonically into and above the atmosphere. The spray from these enormous fountains produced torrential rain such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The supersonic fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the widening crack. This produced huge volumes of sediments that settled through the floodwaters, trapping and burying plants and animals, forming the fossil record. Eventually, the crack became so wide that the newly exposed floor of the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, with lubricating water still beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of approximately 40 to 50 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, and like a runaway crashing train, they compressed, crushed, buckled, and thickened, rising out of the floodwaters. This is why the major mountains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. This is why the major mountains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. This is why the major mountains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. This is why the major mountains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. Today's major mountains were all pushed up in hours. Today's major mountains were all pushed up in hours. Today's major mountains were all pushed up in hours. Today's major mountains were all pushed up in hours. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated.
We travel south from Andhra Pradesh into the state of Tamil Nadu, into the coastal megacity of Chennai. Tamil Nadu is located on the southeast tip of India on what is called the Coromandel Coast. This coast has a different rainfall pattern than other places we've visited in this series. The majority of India gets its rainfall from the southwest monsoon that takes place between June through September. That rainfall reaches India, but is blocked by the Western Ghats Mountains, creating a rain shadow on the Coromandel coast. Later on in the season, the winds change direction and bring the northeast monsoon in October and November, raining moisture from the Bay of Bengal over the Coromandel coast. This is when Chennai receives heavy rainfall, totaling an average of 1,400 millimeters or 55 inches per year. Chennai is an urban megaregion of over 11 million people. Its primary water supply is from a series of rain-fed lakes located within and adjacent to the city. Looking at Chennai's water in economic terms, Chennai basically lives paycheck to paycheck without a lot of savings, meaning these lakes fill up with the monsoon rains and supply water to the city and help recharge local bore wells. But there's no big water supply buffer for when the northeast monsoon fails, meaning that every year the city is only one poor monsoon season away from scarcity. And for 3 years between 2017 and 2019, the rains did fail, and these lakes dried up as the seasons progressed, until in the summer of 2019, the city hit a breaking point.
California is a state that is well known for a lot of things, but one of the most infamous problems that it's been known for recently is a major one that's been getting a lot worse as time has gone on. Water, the very lifeblood of everything, is often a challenging resource to come by here. With an abundance of highly rich and fertile soil throughout the Central Valley, and coupled with a warm Mediterranean-style climate, California produces roughly 1/3 of America's vegetables, and 2/3 of the country's fruits and nuts. The Central Valley alone produces more than 8% of America's entire agricultural output by value, and produces roughly 1/4 of the nation's supply of food. More than 250 different kinds of crops are grown by farmers in California, but out of all of them, the crop that always seems to get the most attention are almonds. This is a map of where you, me, and all the 7.8 billion other humans on the planet currently live. It shows two totally different and separate realities experienced on our planet. The inhabited, populated world made up of cities and settlements of people where nearly all of us watching this video live in, and where nearly everyone you've ever met or heard of exists in. And then there's the rural, underpopulated frontiers that are still largely devoid and empty of any of us. This picture tells a million different stories, but the one I want to focus on for this video are straight lines. There are only 2 locations on this map where the settled world and the empty world are nearly perfectly divided by a straight, almost human-looking designed border. The first is here within the African continent, and it's obvious why it exists. To the south of the line is the African Sahel, a semi-arid belt that wraps across the continent, where rainfall is limited but still actually exists. And to the north of the line is, of course, the Sahara Desert, one of the most hostile environments on the planet to human life, where several years in a row can pass by without a single drop of rainfall, and where the average temperature can soar to more than 40 degrees Celsius for months at a time. It's no wonder that nobody lives there, but the other straight line boundary between the 2 different worlds of our Earth is significantly stranger, because it slices down the center of the most powerful nation in human history, the United States of America. If you zoom in more closely on it, you'll notice that this sharp division between populated America and unpopulated America follows a nearly vertical line south to north, immediately to the west of many major population centers like San Antonio, Austin, Fort Worth, Oklahoma City, Wichita, Lincoln, Omaha, Sioux Falls, Fargo, and up to Winnipeg in Canada. These are the cities that quite literally mark the boundary of the North American frontier, a fact that becomes just as obvious when you switch out the population density map for a satellite view of the United States at night. To the east of these frontier cities is a nearly continuous chain of lights, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean and the eastern seaboard. And to the west of them is but a sea of darkness, with only scattered islands of light and civilization. If you drive from the east to the west across this invisible line at any point, you will immediately notice the sharp difference in the distances between communities, gas stations, and general stores. In general, this invisible line separating the more developed east from the more rural west follows the 98th meridian of longitude, and it sharply divides the American population in half. And here it is again in a map that doesn't even have anything at all to do with humans. It's just a map showing the diversity of tree species within the US, where the line is, once again, pretty clearly visible, with significantly less variety of tree species to the west of it. Even plants follow the unspoken law of this line. So what the hell is actually going on here? As you move westwards across North America, annual rainfall decreases dramatically. Dallas to the east of the line receives 38 inches of rain a year, while Abilene over to the west of the line only receives 26 inches, and Midland even further to the west only receives 15 inches. This is a pattern that repeats itself all the way up and down the line as well. Oklahoma City gets 33.5 inches of rainfall, while Amarillo to the west only gets less than 20. Wichita in Kansas gets 34 inches a year, while Dodge City just a bit over to the west only receives 19. It simply rains a lot less to the west of the line than to the east of the line, and that simply makes sustaining life and civilization much more challenging. Which is why humans and trees alike are all fewer and more scattered beyond it. A century and a half ago, John Wesley Powell correctly identified one of the geographic explanations behind this North American law of nature: the Great Rocky Mountains. They are the third longest mountain chain in the entire world after all, spanning for more than 3,000 miles across the continent, from the northern reaches of British Columbia up in Canada, all the way down to New Mexico in the south, and with peaks soaring up into the sky as high as 13,000 and 14,000 feet. These long and towering peaks effectively act like a colossal wall, blocking most of the moisture blowing in on clouds from the Pacific Ocean, and therefore preventing most rain from passing beyond them towards the arid plains of the east. This effect is called a rain shadow, and the shadow cast by the Rockies across the North American plains is enormous. But of course, there are many other geographic factors at play here as well that determine North America's straight climate line. For one, the Rocky Mountains aren't the only mountain chain on the continent that block moisture blowing in from the Pacific. There's also the Cascades stretching across the Pacific Northwest, creating in their span a clear division between the wet, rainy, and narrow coastal plain to their west, between them and the Pacific Ocean, where big cities like Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland have all been able to be established, and the drier, more arid environments found over to the east, where the moisture blowing in from the Pacific fails to penetrate into. Washington State itself could not be any more climatically different than between its west and east because of these mountains. Seattle, to the west of the Cascades on the narrow coastal plain exposed to the Pacific, receives 37 inches of rain a year, whereas the small town of Mattawa, just over on the eastern side of the Cascades, receives only 4.5 inches of rain per year, which is about the same as infamously dry Las Vegas. And further to the south in Nevada and California are of course the Klamath Mountains, the Transverse and Peninsular Ranges, and the most formidable range of all, the Sierra Nevadas, with peaks as high or even higher than the mighty Rockies themselves. All of these high mountain peaks serve to block moisture blowing into the eastern interior from the Pacific Ocean, and in effect, their presence creates only a narrow strip of land across the west coast between them and the ocean where there is suitable amounts of rainfall to sustain large-scale human population centers, running roughly from northern Washington down to the San Francisco Bay. The only reason why Southern California contains major population centers today like LA and San Diego is because they are massively irrigated and supported by a complex system of canals, aqueducts, and pipelines that bring water in from elsewhere like Northern California where it actually rains, and from the Colorado River further to the east. And so, being robbed of almost any moisture blowing in from the Pacific Ocean to the west, the continental interior of North America has very few other other alternative sources for moisture or freshwater that are mostly limited to either rivers or snowmelts. Over on the eastern side of the continent, the biggest mountain range are the Appalachians, which are effectively just speed bumps in comparison to the giants of the west. The highest peak within them, Mount Mitchell, is less than 6,700 feet tall, or less than half the height of the tallest peaks that are seen in the Rockies, the Cascades, and the Sierra Nevadas. As a result, they do very little to block any moisture bellowing into the continent from the Atlantic Ocean in the east. And so, Atlantic winds frequently bring moisture across the East Coast and the eastern Mississippi Basin, enabling large-scale agriculture without any need for irrigation. But, unfortunately, these winter Atlantic storms simply don't make it far enough to bring their moisture to the western plains beyond the 98th and 100th meridian lines of longitude. During the summer months, moisture will also blow into the continent from the Gulf of Mexico, but these winds generally blow northward before curving eastward, which once again dumps rainfall across the eastern United States, but deprives the west of hardly any. As an ultimate result, when you combine all of these factors together, it adds up to there simply being less available freshwater across this empty third of America, meaning less water to drink and less water available for agriculture. All of this is even more problematic when you consider that the American West is already going through what is likely the worst drought the region has seen in thousands of years. With a serious lack of rainfall, much of the American Southwest has been forced to rely on the freshwater provided by the Colorado River for more than a century now. But for the first time in recorded history, the Colorado River is drying up. Colorado provides the fresh water for around 40 million people across the American West, and it is already so thoroughly irrigated and pulled from that the river no longer even reaches its natural delta in the Gulf of California. All of its water is basically used up or diverted elsewhere before it can even reach it.
Tamil Nadu is located on the southeast tip of India on what is called the Coromandel Coast. This coast has a different rainfall pattern than other places we've visited in this series. The majority of India gets its rainfall from the southwest monsoon that takes place between June through September. That rainfall reaches India, but is blocked by the Western Ghats Mountains, creating a rain shadow on the Coromandel Coast. Later on in the season, the winds change direction and bring the northeast monsoon in October and November, raining moisture from the Bay of Bengal over the Coromandel Coast. This is when Chennai receives heavy rainfall, totaling an average of 1,400 millimeters or 55 inches per year.
Mojave Desert itself is located entirely east of the towering Sierra Nevada mountains of California, with peaks as high as Mount Whitney at 14,505 feet, the highest point anywhere in the contiguous 48 United States, and a mere 85 miles away as the crow flies from the aforementioned Death Valley, the lowest point on the North American continent at 282 feet beneath sea level. These towering mountains block most of the moisture that blows into North America from the westerly winds of the Pacific, and they therefore cast what's known as a rain shadow across their east, where the moisture coming in from the Pacific fails to penetrate into. Thus, the areas to the east of these mountains in the state receive substantially less rainfall and snowfall than the rest of the state does, and this is largely why the areas here are made up of the Sonoran and Mojave deserts.
Ngats Mountains, Ngats Mountains, Ngats Mountains, Ngats Mountains.
Howering Mountains, Howering Mountains, Howering Mountains, Howering Mountains.
Over at the mountain, and the entire north face was in motion, was sliding down, and it's such an unbelievable view that I like shook my head and I said, am I really seeing this?
The renowned Japanese farmer Masanobu Fukuoka suggested a bold plan of assembling hundreds of thousands of seeds of all types and rolling the seeds into tiny clay balls, which he called seed balls. He proposed to load the seed balls up into an airplane. The plane would fly over vast wastelands and drop the seed balls out of the plane over a wide area. The seeds would fall to the ground and then rest, protected by the clay in their little balls, mixed with some manure for fertilizer, and then wait for rain. When the rains came, the clay would melt away and the seeds would germinate. So by dropping a huge variety and quantity of seeds, then some species would find the right spot and take root, and we would begin to see the buildup of biomass, necromass, and biodiversity, and the jump-starting of biological activity and ecological succession, without ever even needing to touch the ground.
The Canadair 515 will also be a capable multi-mission aircraft to operate outside of fire season. The Canadair 515 will also be a capable multi-mission aircraft to operate outside of fire season. Can make a pass on a fire every 10 minutes, and often also in fleet formation, and often also in fleet formation, and often also in fleet formation.
If you do nothing to a piece of land in temperate climates, it will become a forest. The forces of nature are actively moving the land towards a balanced, sustainable, and resilient ecosystem. This is called succession. In southwest England, an unusual forest is growing. Nut trees, fruit trees, shrubs, and perennial vegetables are planted in a way that mimics a natural woodland. This forest garden is the life's work of Martin Crawford, an unconventional gardener who grows 500 edible plants, 500 edible plants, 500 edible plants, 500 edible plants, with just a few hours of maintenance per month. With just a few hours of maintenance per month. With just a few hours of maintenance per month.
These trees are thriving on neglect, fruiting like no other. These trees are thriving on neglect, fruiting like no other. These trees are thriving on neglect, fruiting like no other. I mean, look at this. Look at this. No lack of food. And not just regular food. We're talking about free 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 food. Like, nobody eats this stuff.
High trees, smaller trees, shrubs, perennials, ground cover layers, root crops, and climbers.
You're basically being Mother Nature. You're trying to create a mixed forest.
Perennials, 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 perennials.
And then we come back in the spring with a really good mix of native tree species, and we're ready to plant them. And then we come back in the spring with a really good mix of native tree species, and we're ready to plant them.
Look at this. No lack of food. And not just regular food. We're talking about free food.
Follow-up studies have shown that incomes have risen threefold.
This is an industry that California absolutely dominates, as around 80% of the entire worldwide supply of almonds are produced within the state and are worth around $6 billion a year.
So, income has doubled and expenditure has become half. So, that is how they see their experience.
Okay.
The farmers used to produce only 8 quintals of grain per hectare before, but now they can produce from 20 to 32 quintals.
In less than 10 years, 10 million hectares have been improved through enclosure. 15 million hectares have been treated with conservation measures, and at least 30 million people have benefited from the program. The environment has profited too. Biodiversity is back. Once more, it's a living landscape. The State Minister sees the approach as integral to a new national strategy.
This climate resilient green economy strategy helps the country, and also there is a sign that it is helping to ensure greening the country. This will help ensure food security of the country and the poverty reduction.
Ethiopia has a clear roadmap for the future, and there's a buzz of excitement and a feeling of pride on this journey into a greener and better fed future.
They host a competition called the Water Cup, which is a contest between villages in the state of Maharashtra to see which village can install the most water harvesting structures in a 45-day period. Since 2016, thousands of villages have competed, and the resulting water harvesting structures equate to over 145 billion gallons, or 550 billion liters of water storage capacity built between 2016 and 2020. The Water Cup competition builds water tables and builds them fast with an all-volunteer labor effort. The competition starts at midnight, and the villagers get to work with a massive push over the 45 days. They are then judged both on the quality and quantity of water harvesting structures built. Then all these structures await the monsoon rains. When the rains come, so much water is soaked into the ground because of all the work that water tables are replenished in just one rainy season, and the entire fortune of the village turns around in a very short time, as people can now plant crops 2 or more times per year instead of just planting with the rains. This stabilizes the economy and ends economic migration to the cities for work. This project wins the #1 position because of the sheer scale and speed by which they're restoring watersheds and transforming rural society. This is an example that can lead the world.
Punya tun cita din jam ti cem, punya tu hok tu no, koin damnya tu hok tu no okay cem.
Indonesia's land of Papua, Tanah Papua. Consisting of 2 provinces, Papua supports one of the only remaining large tropical forests in the world. With the Amazon and Congo basins, these forests serve as the lungs of the planet.
High trees, smaller trees, shrubs, perennials, ground cover layers, root crops, and climbers.
My name's Anna Branduzzi. I'm Reforestation Coordinator with Green Forest Work.
I'm Michael French, Director of Operations for Green Forests Work. And our mission is to restore healthy, productive forests on mined lands across the Appalachian region and beyond. These areas, before they were mined, were healthy, productive, biodiverse forests. Oaks, hickories, cherries, maple, poplar, hemlocks, and pines. But in recent decades, surface mining became really widespread. Reforestation used to be a common practice, but after the Surface Mining Act was passed, they began compacting everything to prevent landslides, erosion, and then they seed it with aggressive grasses and legumes to really green everything up. And it became very costly to reestablish forests on these sites. Because the ground is so compacted and so tight, the trees would either die or would be very stunted. So what we do is deal with the invasive exotic species using herbicides or a small bulldozer to get everything back down to a blank slate.
After the grasses are set back, we come in with bulldozers with ripping shanks on the back to decompact the site.
So as the bulldozer drives along, it's ripping up the land, it's pulling up boulders.
After we decompact the land, we see the benefits right away. Native forest adjacent to these mine lands to begin seeding into the site. Wildlife start spreading seeds. We see wildflowers blooming. Water and nutrients are able to infiltrate the soil so that the trees have a greater chance of survival.
And then we come back in the spring with a really good mix of native tree species, and we're ready to plant them.
We have to work with a lot of partners here to get the project completed.
It takes a lot of people, so it's not just one organization alone.
PEC and Green Forest Works and DCNR and Game Commission and you name it. We all have different interests in this, and that's what's great about these projects. They hit so many levels from carbon sequestration to water quality that it can bring different stakeholders like this to the table.
Since 2009, Green Forest's work has reforested about 5,000 acres through the planting of more than 3.1 million trees. But there's still about 1 million acres out there that could benefit from further reforestation practices. So we're really just starting to ramp up and scale up.
It all started in 1995 when John D. Liu, as an ordinary cameraman, got an assignment to film the Lush Plateau in China. He saw how the local people transformed an area almost the size of the Netherlands from a barren, exhausted desert into a large green oasis. He was baffled. From that moment on, greening deserts became his goal in life.
So if you were to live 2 or 3 or 4 or 500 years, then that much larger brow that you see indenting up right there is precisely how your skull would look.